The sun was slowly rising over the peaceful suburb of Oakville, flooding the streets with warm golden light. Zanya Cole's two-story house, with its neat garden and snow-white fence, was the epitome of family harmony. Neighbors often said that this was where the perfect family lived. Zanya, a 57-year-old woman with a soft voice and tired eyes, started her morning as usual. She went into the kitchen to make coffee, inhaling the familiar aroma of freshly ground Arabica. Her movements were precise, even automatic. The kitchen, with its bright countertops and shelves lined with family photos, seemed to mirror her life. Every detail carefully thought out, every corner spotlessly clean. Zanya's gaze fell on one of the photos on the fridge. She, Tarl, their daughter Esme, and their son Kian. It was taken last Christmas when the family got together. Tarl, always wearing a suit even in family photos, was smiling confidently, radiating success. Esme, his eldest daughter, was the spitting image of him, ambitious, sharp-tongued, and always striving to achieve more. Kian, the younger son, was modest and a bit reserved. The family looked perfect. This morning, Terrell was focused on his daily schedule as usual. At 7:30 a.m., he left the house, holding a thermos of coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. His black Mercedes quietly pulled out of the driveway. Terrell worked as an engineer for a large firm, and his morning departures were part of a well-established routine that Zanya never questioned. Across the street at Noella Harper's house, there was also movement. Noella, a 49-year-old woman with short brown hair and a friendly smile, stepped out onto the porch in a long robe, holding a cup of tea. Her dog, a golden retriever named Max, lazily lay at her feet. Noella had always seemed like a part of the family. She helped organize holidays, brought her famous pies, and was a frequent visitor to the Cole home. That morning, however, Noella had a worried look on her face. She was nervously scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing over at the Cole house. Her behavior seemed unusual. Max looked up, picking up on her tension, and growled softly. She seemed to be waiting for something, or afraid of someone. In her living room, Zanya was dusting the shelves as she always did, pausing for a moment in front of the portrait from their wedding. It was the day when she thought that her whole life was defined by happiness and stability, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this perfect world. Little things began to surface. Terrell's strange delays, phone calls that he would suddenly end as soon as she entered the room, and frequent visits to Noella to help with repairs. A few weeks ago, a neighbor, Devon Reed, casually mentioned that he had seen Terrell on Noella's porch late at night. He smiled, thinking it was just part of their friendship. But this detail bothered Zanya. Something about their usual routine suddenly seemed foreign. Terrell, who had always been predictable and confident, now sometimes looked nervous, kept his phone by his side even at night. These were small details that began to form a disturbing picture in Zanya's mind. This morning, for the first time, she felt that she needed to know the truth. Was it just her imagination, or was there really something hiding behind the perfect shell of their life? Oakville seemed like a place where time slowed down. People here enjoyed a quiet life, hiding from the noise of the metropolis and appreciating the closeness of their community. The street where Cole and Harper lived was impeccably maintained, with a green lawn in front of every house, flower beds that changed with the seasons, and neighbors who greeted each other with smiles even if they didn't talk much. Zanya and Terrell's house was one of the nicest on the street. Zanya always took pride in her home. The facade of the house was freshly painted, and the flower beds were decorated with seasonal flowers. Inside, everything was just as perfect. Shiny floors, impeccably arranged furniture, and numerous family photos. Her organization of holidays became a tradition. At Christmas, neighbors would come to the Coles for dinner, where everyone sat around a large table under the light of garlands. Zanaya believed that these moments were proof of their perfect life. Noella Harper has always been a part of these events. Her pies were legendary in the neighborhood, and her charisma was the reason why even those who usually kept to themselves loved her. Noella helped with everything from setting the table to decorating the house for the holidays. She even sometimes stayed after parties to help Zanya with cleaning. It was a classic neighborhood friendship that seemed unbreakable. The neighborhood was famous for its close-knit spirit. They organized street barbecues where children played together, and adults exchanged news. Doors were often left open because no one was afraid of intrusions or crime. It was a community where everyone knew each other by name. However, this closeness sometimes hid its secrets. In recent months, cracks began to appear in the Coles' lives, invisible to others but obvious to Zania. It seemed that everything had changed imperceptibly, but finally, Terrell began to spend more time at Nola's house. He said he was helping her with repairs, small jobs that needed a man's hand, painting a wall, replacing a bathroom faucet, or adjusting the garden lights. At first, Zania didn't pay attention, considering it part of their friendship. But the frequency of these visits began to bother her. Sometimes Terrell would even stay late in the evening, saying that the work had taken longer than he expected. Another change in her husband's behavior was more subtle, but noticeable to Zania. He started keeping his phone closer to him. Whereas before he usually had his phone on the kitchen table or in the living room, now it was always in his pocket or on his night table. When the phone rang, he often quickly pressed the reject button or left the room to answer it. Nola also began to behave differently. While she used to be casual, often dropping by for coffee unannounced, her visits became less frequent. Even when they met, she avoided Zania's gaze. Her conversations became short and her answers too cautious. One day during a neighborhood picnic, when Zania tried to hug Noella goodbye, she visibly tensed and quickly backed away. It was strange because Noella was always open and warm. One morning while Zania was walking her dog, she saw Terrell coming out of Noella's house with a box in his hand. He said he was helping her move her things to the garage. But something about his behavior struck her as odd. His smile was too artificial, and his tone of voice was nervous. These details seemed small at first, but over time they began to form a pattern that alarmed Zania. Her trust, which had previously seemed unshakable, began to be questioned. Zania observed changes in Terrell's behavior that were hard to ignore. What had seemed like the normal life of a busy engineer had now become a source of constant doubt. He started coming home later than usual. His excuses sounded rushed and unconvincing. He was late for a meeting, stopped by the store, or helped a colleague with his car. However, the small details didn't add up. The hours he gave in his excuses contradicted his office's usual schedule. One evening, when Terrell said he would work late as usual, he returned home at almost 10 o'clock in the evening. His shirt smelled not of the usual office environment, but of something that resembled perfume. When Zania asked him what took him so long, he said he had stopped to have dinner with a client. She was alarmed by the nervousness in his voice. A few days later, she was washing his shirt and came across a receipt in his pocket. It was a bill from a restaurant in the city center, dated the same evening. The order included 2 main courses, a bottle of expensive wine, and dessert. The restaurant was a well-known place for romantic dates, but Zania had never been there with Terrell. A neighbor, Devon Reed, a friendly man who often walked his dog near the Coles' home, happened to mention a detail that made Zania wary. One morning, when he met her at the mailbox, he said, "Your Terrell seems to be a jack of all trades. I always see him over at Noella's, fixing something or moving something. Such a good neighbor. It's rare nowadays." Zania tried to hide her reaction, but her hands were shaking. She tried to feign indifference by nodding at Devon's words, but inside she felt cold. It confirmed her fears that Terrell was spending more time at Noella's house than she had realized. After this conversation, she began to notice how the neighbors reacted to her husband. In their shared conversations, some of them cautiously mentioned how often Terrell appeared at Noella's house. Some thought it was a joke, but for Zania, it was a signal that helping a neighbor was just an excuse. These warning signs did not leave Zania indifferent. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination. However, over time, the anxiety became so strong that it affected her physical and emotional state. Sleepless nights became a habit. She would lie in the dark, listening to Terrell sleeping peacefully next to her, and try to figure out if it could all be a coincidence. Her thoughts became obsessive. During her morning chores, she wondered if she could find more evidence. During dinner, she analyzed Terrell's every word, looking for inconsistencies. Her hands shook as she cooked or watered the flowers in the garden. Every time she looked across the street at Noella, she felt as if her neighbor was trying to avoid her gaze. Zania was trapped. She couldn't accuse her husband without evidence, but she didn't have the strength to let it go. Her trust, which she considered the foundation of her marriage, was slowly crumbling. She was afraid to hear the truth because it could completely destroy her life, which she had been building for 35 years. One morning, when Zanya decided to clean the living room, a book on the coffee table caught her attention. It was Terrell's favorite novel, which he often reread, but this time there was a piece of paper peeking out of it. At first, she thought it was just a simple bookmark, perhaps a note with some work notes. Her hand trembled as she pulled it out of the book. The letter was written in Noella's hand. Her handwriting, with its round letters and flowing lines, was familiar to Zania, as Noella had left notes with recipes or shopping lists before. But the text of this letter made her break out in a cold sweat. It spoke of meetings that they had carefully concealed and words that could not be interpreted otherwise. Terrell, you made me feel loved again. I dream about that evening and hope that the next meeting will be just as unforgettable. But be careful. We can't take any chances. Her world began to fall apart. She sat in her chair, clutching that piece of paper, and felt her heart pounding in her throat. She found it difficult to breathe. This was the first indisputable proof that her suspicions were justified. That evening, while Terrell was taking a shower, his phone was on the kitchen table, which was a rarity. He always kept it with him. Zanya, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, decided to break her own principles and pick up the phone. Her fingers slid across the screen, opening the latest messages. There was no frankness in the correspondence with Noella, but the tone and hints were obvious. Thanks for yesterday. It was unforgettable. I think about you all the time. Don't forget about our tomorrow. The wine is on me. These words shattered the remaining illusion. The dates and times of the messages coincided with the evenings when Terrell was supposedly working late or helping a neighbor. During one of the tense conversations between Zania and Terrell in their bedroom, when the voices grew louder, Esme happened to hear snippets through the door. Her heart sank when she heard the words betrayal and Noella. The daughter, who had always considered her parents an example of a perfect marriage, was stunned. She didn't know how to react, but she felt her family was coming apart at the seams. Later, Esme mentioned to her mother that she had overheard the conversation. "Mom, what's going on? Did you and Dad have a serious fight about something?" Zanya, not wanting to involve her daughter, answered evasively, but she could feel the tension in the family beginning to affect the children. Keon, the younger son, was less emotional, but no less observant. He noticed his mother looking more worried and the atmosphere in the house becoming tense. One day, when he noticed Zania staring at Terrell's phone for a long time, he asked, "Is everything okay, Mom?" She nodded, but her eyes said otherwise. Keon decided not to interfere, but he knew inside that something was seriously wrong. After finding the letter and reading the messages, Zanya realized that she needed hard evidence. She began to conduct her own investigation, as if in a detective series she used to love to watch. One afternoon, while Terrell was at work, she opened their shared file drawer. Old receipts and checks caught her eye. Among them, she found several suspicious ones. Bills from restaurants they had never been to together, and even a hotel reservation in Toronto dated the month Terrell said he was on a business trip. She also looked at his bank statements. Strange transactions for flower shops and boutiques confirmed that Terrell was spending money on someone else. Zanya began to observe her husband's behavior more. She noticed how often he left the room to talk on the phone, how cautiously he answered her questions. Every time she hinted at Noella, his tone became harsh and defensive. This only reinforced her suspicions. This period was the beginning of a real emotional breakdown for Zanya. She couldn't eat, sleep, or even perform normal tasks without thinking that her marriage had become a lie. Her fight for the truth was just beginning, and she was ready to go all the way to find out what was going on behind her back. It was a cool Saturday morning when Zanya, holding back her tears in anger, decided to take action. She left the house and headed for Noella's house. Each step felt heavy, as if her feet were made of lead, but her determination was stronger than her fear. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed to echo throughout the neighborhood. When Zanya knocked on the door, she felt her hands tremble. She wanted to run away, but she couldn't live in the unknown any longer. A few seconds later, the door opened, and Noella appeared on the threshold, wearing a bathrobe and a confused look on her face. Her smile, which had always looked so natural before, was now forced. We need to talk, Zanya said, her voice cold and broken. Noela looked away and stepped back, gesturing for her to come in. They sat down in the living room, which always seemed so welcoming and cozy, but this time the atmosphere was tense. Zanya watched Noela fidget with the hem of her robe, trying to avoid making direct eye contact. I know about you and Terrell, Zanya said, clenching her fists in her lap. Her voice trembled, but she kept her firmness. Tell me the truth. How long has this been going on? Noela remained silent, looking down at her hands. Her face paled as she realized that it was no longer possible to hide it. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with tears. 10 years, Noela said quietly, her voice cracking with emotion. It started. It just happened. I didn't plan it. Zanya felt the air rush out of her lungs. She had already suspected, but hearing it from Noela's lips was different. Her body tensed, and she rested her hands on the arms of the chair. 10 years. 10 years you came into my house, ate at my table, played the role of my friend, knowing you were betraying me? Her voice was filled with pain and rage. Noela began to cry, but this did not elicit sympathy from Zanya. Zanya stood up, forcing Noela to continue. Is that all? Just you? She asked coldly. Noela looked at her through her tears and spoke softly. No. I know there were others. I know about 1 or 2 women, but I didn't ask. I was afraid to find out more. This confession broke Zanya. Her anger immediately gave way to a feeling of emptiness. Everything she had built was destroyed. She left Noela's house wordlessly, with her heart pounding in her chest and the knowledge that she needed an immediate explanation from Taro. Taro returned home late that afternoon, expecting a normal evening. But when he walked into the living room, he saw Zanya sitting on the couch, with the letter he had found, her phone with open messages, and several receipts in front of her. Her gaze was fixed, but there were flames of anger in it. Sit down, she said shortly, pointing to the chair opposite. Terrell started to say something mundane, but she interrupted him. I said sit down. He slowly lowered himself into the chair, his face remaining calm, but a shadow of concern flickering in his eyes. I know everything, Terrell. The letter, the messages, the checks. I was at Noela's. She told me everything. He looked at her, smiling slightly, and shook his head. You're exaggerating. Noela, she likes to be dramatic. Nothing happened. His indifferent tone made Zanya even angrier. Don't you dare lie to me, Terrell. It doesn't work anymore. I've seen everything. And if you don't come clean now, you're not only going to lose me, you're going to lose everything. Terrell leaned back in his chair, his smile growing even wider. Do you really think you can prove anything? You're letting your imagination play tricks on you. I was just helping my neighbor. All this evidence is just your imagination. His laughter was the last straw. Zanya felt her heart clench with pain. Her husband's indifference, his willingness to deny, even when the truth was obvious, tore her apart from the inside. She stood up, abruptly grabbed the evidence from the table, and left the room, leaving Terrell sitting in his complacency. Everything that had kept Zanya in line began to disappear. Her patience and restraint dissolved under the pressure of emotion. Something in her broke, and this was only the beginning of her final decision. That evening, Zanya and Terrell's house seemed as quiet as ever, but inside the atmosphere was more tense than ever. Zanya sat in the kitchen, staring into an empty cup, her thoughts racing like waves in a storm. Every word Terrell had said, his smile, his indifference, everything repeated in her mind like a stuck record. Her whole life now seemed like a performance. Everything in this house, every memory was distorted by the shadow of betrayal. She remembered how they had built this house together, chosen the furniture, raised the children. Was it real? Or was Terrell lying even then, creating the appearance of stability? Zanya got up, went to the closet, and pulled out an old cookbook. She flipped through its pages until she came across another note hidden between the recipes. It was another letter from Noela, short but filled with reaffirmation of their connection. The feeling of helplessness was replaced by a growing anger. Her hands clutched the letter so tightly that it almost tore. Her mind was filled with dark thoughts that she had never allowed herself before. How much more do I have to endure, she thought. When Zanya returned to the living room, Terrell was sitting in his favorite chair with a newspaper in his hands. He looked calm, even content. It was a picture of absolute indifference, a man who believes that everything is under his control, that no betrayal can destroy his life. Zanaya walked over to the kitchen table, where a heavy cast-iron frying pan stood. Her hands automatically reached for it. She looked at the frying pan, and then at Terrell. His indifferent look caused an avalanche of emotions. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the years of lies, her efforts that he had rejected, her trust that he had trampled on. Her breathing became labored, her hands clenched tighter as she picked up the frying pan. Each step toward him was like a flash in his mind. He didn't even notice her. His attention was riveted on the newspaper. When she stopped behind him, her gaze was fixed. Her hands lifted the frying pan, and her anger and despair merged into one. The first blow hit the back of his chair, and the sound made him flinch. He turned around to see his wife with the frying pan raised, his face filled with fear for a moment. But he didn't have time to react. The second blow was quick and accurate, hitting him in the head. The newspaper fell to the floor, and his body went limp. Zanya didn't stop. Her movements were mechanical, as if all her emotions had taken over her mind. She threw punch after punch, her body shaking with tension. Only when the room was filled with silence did she realize what had happened. The frying pan fell from her hands to the floor with a thud. She stared at Terrell's motionless body, her thoughts blurred. She felt neither victory nor relief. All that remained was the burden of what she had done. The silence in the house was oppressive. Zanya slowly walked to the phone and dialed 911. Her voice sounded calm as she told the operator, "I killed my husband. Come." She hung up the phone, sat down on the couch, and stared in front of her. The sound of the blows echoed in her mind for a long time, like an echo of what she had just done. The silence that covered the house after the call to the police seemed eerie. Zanya sat on the couch in the living room, her hands still shaking. She was staring at nothing, as if trying to realize what had happened. The frying pan was on the floor, the fragments of her life scattered next to it. Half an hour later, police cars stopped on the street in front of the house. Red and blue lights reflected in the windows, waking the neighbors. Zanya got up when she heard officers' footsteps at the door. She opened it for them without waiting for a knock. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she immediately said, "I did it! He's dead!" The officers entered the house, focused but cautious. One of them looked around the room, stopping his gaze on Terrell's motionless body. The second approached Zanaya, handcuffing her. She didn't protest. Her face was emotionless, but there was a deep emptiness in her eyes. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer read her rights, but his voice sounded like a background, distant and unimportant. The scene quickly attracted the attention of neighbors. People stood on their porches and peered through their windows, trying to understand what had happened. It was a shock for those who had always considered the Coleys the perfect couple. Rumors began to spread even before the police car left the street with Zanya in custody. The trial became a sensation for Oakville. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse to cover the case, which shook the quiet and affluent neighborhood. Each new day of the trial added new details to the story that further heightened public interest. Zanya's court-appointed lawyer tried to build a defense on her client's emotional breakdown caused by years of betrayal and manipulation by her husband. During the trial, details came to light that shocked even close family friends. Letters, checks, and messages from Terrell's phone confirmed that his affair with Noella had lasted for more than 10 years. Moreover, it turned out that he had affairs with other women, using family money for gifts and travel. At the last hearing, when the judge announced the verdict, the room was filled with silence. Zanya Cole is found guilty of second-degree murder. Given the circumstances of the case, the court imposes a sentence of 30 years in prison. Zanya accepted the verdict without a word. She sat in the dock with her face still, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her children, Esme and Kian, were present in the courtroom, and their emotions were mixed between disappointment, pain, and sympathy. After the trial, this story became a symbol of the hidden tragedies that can lurk behind even the most ideal facades. Noella Harper did not appear in court. She did not even try to justify herself to her neighbors. As soon as her name was mentioned in the news, she realized that it would be impossible to stay in Oakville. Her home, which used to be her pride, now became a reminder of the scandal. A week after the verdict, Zanya Noella disappeared. One morning her house was empty. Neighbors noticed a truck pull up to her door late at night, and the next morning the house was deserted. The neighbors' attempts to find out where she had moved to were in vain. Her phone was disconnected and her social media accounts deleted. For those who remained in the neighborhood, Noella's story became a symbol of escape from the consequences of their actions. But even in a new place, she could hardly escape the shadow of her past.